to bring it forward to start at 2, and I expect that at 10 to 3 there will be an influx of those people who didn't get the notification of the change. If they didn't get notification, then it's my fault, and I'm very sorry. Important thing to start off with, I'd hoped that Arthur Humphreys would be able to look after us this afternoon. He sends his best wishes, but he's chosen today to fly off to Australia, a sensible man, but he wishes he could be here. May I please check, show of hands, how many here are BTM, were BTM? Oh dear, and are there any other powers people here?
About equal.
Right, I see. The blood will be shed in fairly equal.
Just be careful.
With in different shaped drops.
I'm glad to see that we've got most of the speakers for this afternoon. I haven't yet seen Martin Wright, but I see if he thinks it's starting at 3, he might not be here by 22 or 3, so that'll be exciting. This is the list of the machines we intend to cover during the afternoon. My initials appear far too frequently. I'm prepared as next powers man to talk with some confidence about the EMP. I'll say a little about the BTM series in the certain assurance that I'll be corrected at several stages on the way through by the authorities who are here in such numbers. One other preliminary point, when this session was in preparation, I interestingly had 2 quite independent contributions of what it was like before there were any calculators at all. One from our former President Graham Morris over there, and another from a chap called Bill McHugh in Canberra. Very interesting fellow, spent the Second World War in the listening service. First of all, supplying Bletchley Park from what he was hearing in North Africa, and later in Australia and New Guinea, listening to Japanese and Russian transmissions. He spent his career in the Department of Statistics in Canberra, and he describes exactly as Graham did, that before there were calculators that could do multiplication, one of the ways to deal with the problem was to have a master pack containing, for every value of the multiplicand, a card for each likely value of the multiplier, and some good soul with a comptometer had created the product, and that was punched into the same card. So you took the detail cards of whatever application it was, sorted them into value on multiplier and multiplicand, collated them with this pack, gang punched the product through onto the detail cards, sorted them out, resorted them into the sequence for the required application, and Bob's your uncle.
Probably a grandfather by then.
Now, before these machines even came along, there were precursors. And this is an attempt at a list of what should be in that category. The McClure machine, can anybody put me right on the McClure machine?
There was a Sterling multiplier and McClure. 2 on powers.
Yes.
Australian, I think.
Ah, that's makes sense, because I heard about it also from Bill McHugh.
We had them in North London. Sterling bolts. They did whatever multipliers were, it just chunked it on.
Yeah.
Added it very. You didn't know how long it was going to take a calculation. It depended on the size of the multiplier.
The size of the multiplier.
A
Yeah.
Sterling, it was a Sterling malt, and I think one was a decimal. I think it was a Remington or a Master. McClure was Sterling.
Right. So the first serious multipliers were the IBM 601, which arrived at the time when BTM still had its arrangement with IBM. So it was brought into BTM, and the Hollerith label was put on the front and all the other good things. And it churned at, well, 10 cards a minute was fairly typical of that generation. IBM brought the first electronic multiplier the 603 to market in 1946, but typically it didn't have sterling and it didn't get converted to sterling. And it was fairly soon followed by the 604, which was a more successful machine in terms of numbers, and that also remained unconverted. As a stopgap, Arthur Humphreys tells us that the Bull 60, Bull unnumbered, was brought in and laboriously modified in Letchworth to deal with sterling.
There was a thing called the CPC. Was it one of those? Car Program Calculator, IBM.
It was, 604 was part of it,
Right.
yeah.
65 was delivered, I think, or something.
Splendid. I'm going to stop now and hand it over to you.
No.
The very few 506s, Bull multipliers, as they were generally called, were adapted for LSD. And the number that's missing from there is the 504,
Yep.
which was British Tab's
EML.
sterling electromechanical multiplier. And that, I think, was probably late in development. And that's the reason why the 506 was acquired as a stopgap. But it was a big stopgap because I think we had really quite a lot of them.
Yeah. The reason that's missing from that list is because I didn't get Peter Porter's note in bits and bytes until after I produced that slide. Yes.
A chap called Norman Hedges was instrumental in doing the 504.
Right. Thank you. Then IBM produced the two really frontline machines. The defense calculator, which was called a calculator, but in many ways it would qualify to be treated as a fully fledged computer. But only 19 of them were produced, and they all went to defense establishments in the States or defense-related establishments. So it was the 650, which was the first large volume general purpose calculator, and from what I heard just the other day, something like 1,800 of them were produced.
It's not sure in the 650 it was a stored program computer.
Yeah, it was a real computer.
Yes.
Often sold as a complicated tabulator.
So anyway, that's really by way of preamble. What we want to spend most of our consideration on is the second half of the list on that slide, the machines we've got here. Another sideline. Lorin Knight sends his apologies. He had very much wanted to be here this afternoon, but he's got an extremely bad cold and didn't want to share it with you. So I sent him our good wishes and said we'd do our best without him. His paper on these the BTM calculators was published in Resurrection number 23. For those of you who are not members of the Computer Conservation Society, and I can't think why you haven't bothered to join yet, there'll be application forms at the rear on the way out. Resurrection is a journal that the Society publishes at irregular intervals, and the last two copies have had an excellent article by Lorin Knight on the BTM calculators and an excellent article on the 1201, 1202 by Dickie Bird. And if anybody who's not a member of the Society would like to get hold of copies of those, then ring my arm later and something can be done about it. The BEM, the British Electronic Multiplier, was underway when Lorin joined the labs. It's the machine which he says was always known in the labs as the bug-eyed monster, just the right initials for that. But the 541 was the first serious production machine, although it was also rather by way of a prototype, and it was very soon superseded by the 542. And by early 1952, early 1954, the 542 was being produced at a rate of 2 a week, which was pretty good going, and several hundred of these machines were installed with BTM customers in very short order. And I'm going to jump sideways from this list and talk a bit more about the 542 if I can. But just to put them in, the rest of them in context, at the same time, Power Samus were working on the EMPs. The initial EMP came out in 53. The EMP-B and the EMP-C came out simultaneously in 54. The EMP-B, which was the most numerous one, was a decimal and sterling machine. The EMP-C was decimal only for export, including, I believe, an astonishing occurrence, a Power Samus export to the United States. So now let's look through this sequence and this sequence in rather more detail. Can I ask how many people have seen the latest Bits and Bytes? Fairly good number, right. Because Peter Porter included a fascinating account of the Bull electromechanical calculator. But I won't repeat that since so many of you know it already. Another acknowledgement, I think, at this stage. I'm deeply grateful to Bruce Macmillan in Dunedin, who works in cahoots with the Settlers Museum in that splendid city, and who spent most of his working life as an engineer at Cadbury's, the confectionery firm. They got a big factory in Dunedin, and he looked after machines for them right from the pre-calculator stage up until he retired in the late 80s. And he's the splendid fellow who's ensured that the Settlers Museum contains a complete ICT 1301 and an EMP and a Power Samus tabulator and summary card punch and a variety of other splendid stuff. And he's also got a comprehensive library, and at deep cost to his pocket, he sent me all sorts of valuable copies of valuable manuals, including the operators' manuals for the BTM calculator series, and in several cases the field engineers' manuals for those as well. So the various stuff up here, if there's time at the end, do please come and browse. It's characteristic of all the BTM calculators that they had a calculating box coupled to a fairly simple derivation of a standard gang punch, so that you had two, or in the case of the treble five, three boxes, at least one of which was a fairly conventional piece of equipment and could, when separated from the calculating box, could operate as an absolutely standard gang punch. The Power Samus reaction to that was this frightfully wasteful use of the customer's floor space. The internals of the 542, I'll show you. Is this tolerably visible?
Just about.
Okay, well, the internals are based on a 9-digit multiplier register, a 14-digit multiplican, and a 14-digit product register. There are two internal pathways. This is the wrong way. Two internal pathways, path A and path B. And the multiplier, multiplican, and product register have paths out to both those paths. There are 4 stores in the 542. The 541 was essentially similar, but only had 3 of these stores. Store 1 exits to path A, stores 2, 3, and 4, and 5 go to path B. Both paths lead to the adder. Path B can lead through a complementer to the adder. So if you have an item which you wish to subtract, you've got to emit it on path B to get it through the complementer, because the subtraction is done by adding in complements.
I think there's 2 units missing, the times 2 and the divide by 2, which are needed for multiplying. Because multiplying is perfected by halving and doubling.
On the multiplier, yes. I just say that that's it.
That was a basic. It's called a multiplier, so what else could a multiplier do?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you're right. That's the diagram I got straight out of the manual. And this is entertaining little box. The divide by 10 was if a multiplier had a fractional element, the multiplicand had to be divided by 10 a number of places in order to pretend that the multiplier was integral.
Well, what I thought it was for is when you multiply and divide, that was a Stirling machine, so Stirling had to be in a fixed place. So when you did a multiplication, to check it again, it has a second lot of brushes, it reads the calculation again, shifts the multiplier up by 10 and the multiplicand down by 10. Now to divide on the digit or the registers we had there, if it was holding Stirling, which it did, it was impossible to do it by a shift to the left or a shift to the right, so it had to divide by 10.
That's exactly so.
Stirling divide by 10.
That was a Stirling divide by 10.
That's it.
Yes, you're quite right. The functions which the machine was capable of supporting, the 3 primary arithmetic functions, adding, subtracting and multiplying. This dodge of dividing Stirling by 10, taking account of the different carrying positions for the pence and tens of shillings locations, to cope with fractional multipliers. So there was effectively, you could shift registers, shift a quantity in a register, but only to the right. And effectively, because since the registers were holding material in binny 10 form, a shift to the right was equivalent to a dividing by 10. There was an electronic emitter, so that when in rounding the result of a calculation, you could emit an appropriate value to the position 1 below the last significant place and chop it off at that. The registers operated that when an amount was passed out of the register was automatically zeroized unless you countermanded that and said cycle the contents back to stay in the register. So automatic zeroizing. Split store transfer meant that if you had a complex cross-adding calculation with several components to be added at different stages, you might initially read more than one component into the same store. You could then successively shift and eliminate the appropriate part of the store to get the element you required for this stage of the calculation, use it in the addition, then go back to the store and retrieve the other part of the contents and deal with them. Obviously, you could handle positive and negative on input and output components. And the zero test facility, when, as you said, you did a calculation twice and compared the results, the usual way of organizing this was to subtract the second result from the first, and the answer, of course, should be 0. If it was 0, the zero test would allow the machine to continue, and you go on to the next card. If you failed to get a 0 at that stage, because obviously there was some discrepancy between the two calculations, then the machine would stop at that point. And the last card, which had gone out to the stacker, contained some error, or some error had occurred during the processing of that card. All right so far? Now this is real fun, and this is where I think for the non-BTM people we start moving into the X-Files realm of the unbelievable. Because the machine was equipped with what we would, in Power's terms anyway, call 2 sensing stations.
Pre-reading. Is that right?
That's an additional complication which I had hoped to keep under the carpet. The main reading station took place, for bizarre reasons unintelligible to me, the main reading took place at the additional brushes. The next thing that happened to the card was that it went through the punch station. Following punching, it passed under the punch brushes, so the card could be reread at that stage, and obviously at that stage a punched product could be read back in. So the program we're going to look at considers cards at 3 stages. And what we're going to say is that at the first reading, from this card we will read factor A into store 1, factor B into store 5, and factor C into store 4. When that card moves on to the punch stage, factor D, the product, will be punched. When that card reaches the punch brushes, all the factors will be read back in again. The factor A this time goes straight into the multiplican, factor B into the multiplier, factor C into the into store 3, is it? And factor D, the product, goes into store 2. Now those paths and destinations are chosen so that they don't clash with these 3 destinations. So the factors which are read in at that stage don't go directly into the multiplier and multiplican. They only get transferred to the multiplier and multiplican when the first card has actually moved towards the punch station. And this is a way of reusing the stores so that you've got 2 cards going through a calculation, but they're at different stages of the process.
Right.
I hope I have confused you as much as I've confused myself. Probably.
The interesting thing, Hamish, was the obsession with checking.
Yes.
That people really didn't believe that these things would work.
No.
And so that's quite a complicated arrangement to do the checking.
Yes. Now, this is going to be too tiny to read in detail, but it's an example fully worked out of the type of calculation that we've been talking about. This program covers, in the calculating phase, A times B plus or minus C to give D. And in the checking phase, the calculating is repeated. A times B plus or minus C minus D, the result of the previous calculation, to give 0. And the calculation steps are written out on, this is effectively what we would later have called a programming sheet. And over here, we've got all the stores, the multiplier, multi-products, and the stores 1 to 5, and the virtuous programmer has carefully noted what goes in at every stage. The 542 basically had 20 program steps, but was capable of extension to 30 program steps. Up here, these panels show which card columns are read at the additional brushes, the first reading station, and where they go to. And here we see which card columns are read at the punch brushes and where they go to. And here in a couple of places we've got, although the instruction says add, we've got a note saying complement, in other words, shove the add end through the complementer if there was a particular control hole in the card that's been plugged in the appropriate place. There's a bit of that chart simply blown up, make it slightly more legible. Then we'll come back to that. And then the excitement of plugging. Well, this is the easy bit. This is the plugging on the gang punch. So on this panel, columns 1 to 80, the additional brushes were reading factors A and B and C, and plugging C goes to store 4, A goes to store 1, B goes to store 5, and that control designation is picked up and put there. The punching is easy. Punching from the product, those positions of the product register into columns 24 to 30. And at the punch brushes, we're rereading factor A, but this time putting it straight into the multiplicand. We're reading factor B, putting it into the multiplier, factor C, putting it into store 3, and D into store 2. So that's how the stuff got in and out to the appropriate places. And the program was plugged on a double plug board, and that same program looks like this. And I must say, when I went on a 542 course in, I think, February 1959, I found my round hole brain was boggling a bit when we got to this stage of things. I don't intend that we should work through the whole of that, although I do see that the next speaker, who's on in 2 minutes, hasn't arrived yet. But let's look perhaps at one liner. Program step 13 says 14, I think, from product A and from store 4 to the product, add sterling. So if I superimpose this craftily, like so, we'll see that the plugging essentially says from program step number 14, go across to this line, which establishes the connections from that program step to the various functions. So we go to
the right hand end a little bit.
Hmm?
You need to drop the right hand end of the slide a little bit.
Yes.
That's it.
I knew this was going to be exciting.
Can't get away with anything.
So we've got connected to the add sterling line, to the to product line, to the from product path A line, the complementary designation B, and from store 4. So that's all the elements are involved in that one program step. And once I started working this through, it seemed to me, my God, wasn't it easy when computer programming came along? And you just chose the right instruction, and all the selection of paths and selection of what you were taking and where you were putting it was done for you, provided you used the right instruction. But that's how it was in those days. You plugged everything in extreme detail. Now, at this stage, I was hoping that Martin Wright would be able to be here to give us a virtuoso description of how plugging was really like on, well, you know what an organ is like when you have 1 or 2 manuals. On the treble 5, you had the equivalent of about 5 manuals at the Albert Hall grand organ, because the plugging on the treble 5 was a masterpiece. In piano terms, Franz Liszt at his most vivid.
I think a nightmare would probably be a better description.
Sorry?
A nightmare would be a better description from my
Yes.
memory.
Hamish, just a sort of lighter interlude at this point on plugging. At just about this time, one of the instructors at Moore Hall was teaching his class, which I would want, to do multiplication, or to try and do multiplication on a senior tabulator. And we succeeded very well by cross-plugging across the three boards. So if one actually got the thing to go ticking around, adding up one thing and subtracting from another, non-stop. The only problem was that it beat the commutators to hell.
Martin, very nice to see you.
Get out the front.
Martin, I apologise. You're probably one of the people who didn't receive the message. We were starting this afternoon at 2 o'clock instead of 3.
That's correct.
Yes, well,
No, it's
gather your breath and
there's two of us.
Actually use a Burlington tabulator for fixed multiplication. If you multiply the number of pounds weight by 0.4464, you get a rounding out off effect. You get 1.999. So we made it slightly inaccurate, 4.4465, and then it comes out and looks like right on the out. And we use this in anger for the sales analysis for the plastics division of ICR.
And amazingly, we're still on the revised schedule. Martin, are you prepared to leap instantly into action, or would you like a moment to gather yourself?
Could I ask, while we're setting up, a general question as somebody who was not involved in the punch card era about reliability? I mean, listening to Florida, you would think that Chads were making it impossible to ever get an answer, and it's clear that there was a lot of concern about endless checking in the process. But what sort of reliability were you getting out of the machines? Once the data had been read in, was it likely that you'd get the right answer?
Yes.
Time and time and
Can
time and time again.
Bill Nash. I first met Bill at London Underground at Baker Street, and they had five 542s in a line, and they did all the payroll.
The London Transport Payroll, 100,000 people, they're all in the union. If anything that happened, that you just said, right, well, there's been a strike. It probably wouldn't make much difference to London Transport today. In those days, it was pretty efficient. And what's wrong with the American elections? They do not use what they call a sorting needle. If they push their sorting needle in, they will then got rid of all their chats. So simple. That's why they've all got the needle.
Were chads much of a problem? I don't remember chads being a problem. In fact, chads had the benefit, especially in the early days, punching program cards, which were horrendous. Well, you fish up a chad and stick it in. So it was a great benefit to be able to do that.
Whom I knew latterly before we both retired, when we were doing improbable things in a very good cause with friendly police forces overseas, where we operated on the basis that we liked to take our customers to reference sites in countries that we enjoyed visiting ourselves. So that included Hong Kong, Queensland, Malaysia, and probably our favourite, Botswana. Now, I've asked Martin to talk about the treble 5, and from the list he showed me what he's going to say, I'm going to enjoy it.
Thanks, Hamish. Just to remind people, that's what the beast looked like. Having just listened to some of the questions and the answers just happened as I walked in, I don't think I should be taking it in quite the same sort of engineering detail that obviously Hamish was entertaining with you with earlier. I was very much on the make it work and use it side rather than how it works, so a slightly different viewpoint. I have to confess that I'm totally biased about this machine. In 37 years with ICL, I think it was my favourite machine. It was one I learned last at that great college of knowledge, Moore Hall, and I had several very happy years using it in various parts of the United Kingdom. As you can see from the picture, it's 3 hunks of metal. On the left was the input-output device, otherwise a well-concealed 100 card a minute reader punch. In the middle was the works with a very useful display panel, and on the right was the power units. Basically it had, as I say, 100 cards in and out, and a small drum, and therefore the ability to not just calculate from individual cards, but to take in numbers, references, values, etc. Stick them on a drum and use those in subsequent calculations. The input-output unit, the card punch, was probably the final stretch that was possible of that device. It was starting off, heaven knows when, back in the mist of time, as the IBM 100 card minute summary punch. All and sundry in BTM and ICT hung extra bits on it, made it longer and longer and longer. We finally ended up with 3 read stations, a punch station, and a verification station. And so it had 1 or 2 minor engineering problems, like it was pushing the technology of the Geneva gear to its limits, and that did tend to give trouble. And with 4.5 sets of reading brushes, there were always times when wires got crossed, and it didn't quite need a resident engineer, but it did need quite a lot of looking after. It was a plugged program computer or calculator, depending who you listen to, whether you call it a calculator or a computer. It ran to 150 steps, and if you were clever, you would make that do a lot more steps. You would look upon it as 150 subroutines, and some people did. It was amazing what you could squeeze out of it when you really tried. A lot of people programmed it not with the programming manual, but with the timer chart for the various relays and input-outputs that were around on the thing, so that some people's programs, you could never understand them because they never read what the labels said on the holes. They were just bits of electricity that were coming and going at the right times. The only thing one had to watch, of course, when you were doing all this clever stuff, was that if you didn't get too clever, take up too much time, and suddenly the thing would drop to half speed. You normally try to keep it going at 100 cards a minute, but come the occasion when you try to be too clever, and suddenly it was doing 50 cards a minute. It had a very nice display feature on the that sort of slightly darker grey bit on the main unit there. Had lights for everything. You could see what was coming in, what was going out, what was going to and from the drum, what the results were, how the maths was getting on, all these things. And it made it a very nice machine for debugging, because you could single shot it through every stage of the operations, which made it one of the more user-friendly machines that I've come across at the time. The really interesting process though was actually turning the written program into an operating system. It took plugged programming, I think, to its nth degree. It was quite easy when you were doing a prototype to end up with a mass of plugs, probably up to 4 inches thick, which made for very interesting debugging and altering. Because during its initial stages, you did all with manual plugs, and when you got a bunch of manual plugs into the plug board, it covered up everything, the legends, the holes, the next hole, everything. So it was a little tricky to work your way around. And indeed, what you reckoned you needed was dead reckoning navigation and a very long pair of needle-nose pliers to actually get the thing sorted out. And of course, because you were trying to use functions far more times than the board was originally designed for, you had the wonderful thing called a 4-way connector, which you could get 4 plugs into, and you could nest them in strings. So the chances of things coming adrift somewhere during the process were very high. So testing could be quite exciting because you could change one plug and knock 3 or 4 others out in the process. But the final thing was, of course, once you got it all right, you did it all over again with daisy chain, which was wires with little plugs all the way down them. So you get rid of all these connectors, but of course you've got to get it right, because if you got it wrong, you'd have to start all over again, and So that was really the basics of it. It was the ultimate plug program calculator, or as you say, computer, whichever way you look at it. And it was used very widely, particularly in utilities and government around the country. I'm going to run through sort of several applications that I got involved in and see what anybody else can remember. First time I came across it was in Newcastle, British Rail offices in Newcastle. This was a wonderful Grade 1 listed building that ran all the way down the side of Newcastle Station. High Victorian ceilings, clerks still on wooden stools, high desks. It was a real museum piece in all aspects. I remember I was up there in the winter of 61, 62, which wasn't quite as cold as the following one, but put it this way, it's the only time I've ever seen sea ice. I saw it at Whitley Bay when I was living there. But however, the treble 5 room was extremely popular because at that point they hadn't any extractors on the top, and it was shirt sleeve weather due to something like an 8 kilowatt output. So visiting the computer room was a very popular occupation in that particular office that winter. The application that was being done was something that is totally history now. The accounting for wagon loads of coal from a multiplicity of collieries to a multiplicity of destinations. Something that you couldn't do. I think there's one colliery left now in the area when there were hundreds. There was quite an interesting application, again, of slightly unusual technology in that the input came on marked cents cards. You remember those? Where you had a very carbony pencil, a space on the card, and if you were lucky you got it right. And expression punch machine used to measure electricity going across that bit of carbon, and if you got it right, punch a hole in the card. And they used to have a stock of these in every colliery weighbridge, so that they were pre-punched with the roots on. And when the truck went over the weighbridge, the chap read off the thing and filled in the card, sent them into Newcastle Central Station, where they were interpreted and used to calculate all the charges for getting coal from the coal field to its ultimate destination. And the calculations we used to have to do with that were not just multiplication, but there were tables of rates and distances and like held on the drum, so that all these things could be worked out and added up and produced for the end of month billing. They also did passenger ticket accounting on this machine. They used to produce the ticket returns for every station. If you can remember the old Edmondson card tickets that everybody used to have, which had sequence numbers on them, which were always being checked, so that you entered the first number at the beginning of the month and the last number at the end of the month, and it was all added up and checked against your till. And the system here was that the actual sheets with the opening numbers were produced every month on the from this machine, and then at the end of the month returns would come back and they'd be checked and again worked out on this machine. Again, another interesting piece of kit that I never came across anywhere else that was used to produce these was a card-controlled typewriter. You actually punch the cards out on this machine and then push them through an adapted, it was actually an adapted card punch that was attached to a typewriter, and this typed out all the lists of tickets for all the stations in the northeast of England. Another place that was very well equipped with Triple Fives was the Midland Electricity Board. They had two installations, one at Gloucester and one at Worcester, doing all the bits and pieces that you associate with electricity billing. The application validated and calculated all the information from the meter readings, handled a variety of tariffs, because the information was held in the drum, and all the various non-standard situations that you get in electricity billing. People moving out, people moving in, new meters, all these sort of things, all the variations and bits. The machine was man enough to be able to handle those. I can remember I spent several months in the winter of 1962-63 when we had the big freeze, bumping up and down the A38, long before the days of the M6, from Birmingham down to Worcester and Gloucester, down what was a series, I think it must be about 40 miles of ice potholes for about 3 months. I don't know what it did to my car, but it was interesting. I would make one comment there. There was the manager at the Gloucester installation had a good eye for the ladies in the punchroom. And the punchroom, in fact, was all part of the machine room there. And he used to say there was one very beautiful punch girl that made all the rest look like boys. Never did discover what happened to her. Another installation that used them in that part of the world was the CEGB in Birmingham. They used it for stores accounting, engineering calculations. So you can see it was a very flexible machine. There were all sorts of things you could do with it. Another one up there was Westwinds Gas Walk. That was an interesting installation. At the time they had the largest open plan office in Europe. They've still got it in Solihull. I always remember, on a foggy day in November, you couldn't see from one end to the other. But it was very effective. It was the only open plan office I think I've been into for many, many years. But they actually got the acoustics right. You could actually sit in your individual pig pen in there and not hear what was going on around about you, and you could converse with the people in your pen in a normal voice. It was remarkably effective for its very early version of things that are commonplace nowadays. Again, gas billing, which has all the complexities of electricity billing, with the added complexity, of course, is that you had to do the calorific value and calculate that into the bill as well. So these were all things that could be done using various tables that were held on the drum. They also had a very complicated payroll. Going back to that time, of course, they still had a lot of people who had come in from the pre-nationalised industries, from the various gas works, or municipal gas works around the place. And so there were all sorts of varieties. I think it handled 23 different pension schemes at one time. And plus the fact that at the time they were having great competition with the car industry to get labour, and they had some amazing collection of special allowances they used to pay them. There was boot money and dirt money and walk under the arch money and pay the top of the gas holder money, all these things. And again, the 555 was man enough to tackle all these little odds and ends that were stacked into the payroll system. This was, I suppose, the high period of 555's life, somewhere in the 1961, 64 area. But there was one that hung on for a long time. I remember I'd gone on to other and different things for many years, and suddenly I was fished out to go and sort out one at, I think it was Nottinghamshire County Council. They had been very slow in computerising and had managed to miss, naturally, their installation date of 31st of March. So, of course, all the tax changes had to be, which they thought they'd never have to do again on the 555, had to be done, and chap named David Levand and myself had a very pleasant few days, sort of digging into the back recesses of our grey matter, trying to remember how to program this beast, doing the tax changes. I think it was about 1966. So it was a good, long-lasting machine. So I think, in conclusion, one can say that it was an excellent machine. It was the ultimate punch card machine. As Hamish has told you about the predecessors to it and the way it worked up to a substantial machine. It did have the problem that it was pushing its physical technology to its limits. The punch was its weak point. And I don't think you could have pushed any more plugs into any more holes, into any more boards to make it do more things. I think it was beyond the capability even of needle-nose pliers with low fingertips. And of course, it was coming to the time when lacking a printing capability was a downfall. And really, it had then been overtaken by computers. But I still think of it very much my favourite machine. Any questions?
Yes, two questions about the basic technology, because I know nothing of these machines. What's doing the adding and subtracting and multiplying inside? Relays, valves or transistors? Okay, valves.
Yeah.
And when you talk about plugging, do you have to plug the digits separately, or are they all going serially down one wire, or what?
You plugged, from the input, you plugged the whole width of how many columns you're reading in, one column at a time. So
Okay, so
every
one-
column had a plug.
So So a single conductor, piece of wire.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Thanks.
Like on this diagram, there's a line joining those sockets on the diagram, but in fact it represents 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 plugs,
Yeah.
all running in parallel from those brushes down to that store.
And each of those plugs is a digit.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And those, how do you get 10 numbers down all with a wire?
So
Is it a fault?
no, this single line here
Yes.
is just a diagrammatic
understand that,
convention.
I understand
It's
that.
actually 6.
On
But
the
it-
card.
Each of the circles represents a digit.
Yes.
It's got 10 values.
Yes.
How do you represent a column?
As the card is...
It's that
is-
serial.
It's serial.
Time.
The card reads through, and as the whole passes under the brush, the time of that
Okay.
determines the value of the digit.
So it's effectively serial. Okay, come on.
How many were there, Martin?
What, 555? I don't know, to be honest. There must have been several hundred, I think.
Where was they built?
Where were they built? Castlereagh, Northern Ireland.
Really?
Yeah, one of ICT's really big mistakes.
Martin, you mentioned the drums.
Yeah. Sorry?
I was looking at my sales manual, and that's the 1957 sales manual, and I think it was £15. I may be wrong.
I must admit, a figure of somewhere about 25.
I think it was 25.
Comes to mind, but yeah.
I'm pleased with what you had to say about plugboards, because those who have not played with them just can't imagine the power that lies within a plugboard, especially in the hands of people who really did exploit the treble 5. I used to be in what we call government section. All the rest were regions, but not us. And my favourite customer was AERE Harwell, run by Jack Harwell, Jim Hilston, and his wife. I can't remember her name. But they used to make the treble 5 sit up and beg. Incidentally, it had a square root function. It wasn't very popular in payrolls, but in places like Harwell, it was very good. Another element I remember about that is we had a really big drive in government section to sell treble 5s to the US Air Force bases in this country. And it was with great chagrin that the officers there were finally banned from ordering treble 5s from British Town on the basis of the Buy America Act. And they had to put up with 604s instead. And the treble 5 was undoubtedly markedly superior to the 604. I said, of course it was to the PCC.
It's greeted with relief by government section. You may not be involved, but before you could export the plugs and particularly the connectors to America, you had to get rid of the Hollerith trademark because we were not allowed to use it in America because it belonged to IBM. And the whole of government section, you may not have been there, were obliterating the Hollerith trademarks from everything that went to America with these wretched 555s. Perhaps upon one thing, I could remind people of one useful feature of the power supply, the console. I think it was the only useful feature. It had a strong magnetic field underneath the tabletop, and there was a particular point where you could stand a pin upright. Very useful for demonstrations and things to customers. And perhaps one final word from, you said it was the ultimate. I think the ultimate was the Univac 1004, if anybody was involved in that.
It's heresy, but I would agree.
If only because I could actually work with the plugboard. I've never mastered the plugboard of treble 5.
Can I comment on that? I'm just hoping that we may be able to drum up enough information about the 1004 to make it the nucleus of another occasion like this. 1004 and several other machines.
Well, what it has in the way of storage, data storage, or as they say now, memory. Is that a sensible
Well, they had a drum,
drum? Yes.
and I think it was 3 stores.
I think the drum had 105 words.
Yes.
5 tracks and 21 words and 10 digits, I think.
I'm not really want to.
The drum was technically interesting in that because the data was read every time it came round and rewritten, as a programmer, you could read something, carry out a calculation and put the result in the place where it came from originally, and it would, although the drum had moved on, that was where it was now, because everything got rewritten every cycle of the drum.
So the
Which
drum
North
was a
Control
series of
one and two
delay
is
lines
one
round
hat.
the magnetic drum.
Effectively, yes. Yes.
Something like that.
There was a bit of a snag with the drum. There wasn't any parity or error checking with the drum.
Zero test.
Well, it took 3 program steps to do a checksum of the whole drum. And we found it lasted 20 minutes before it failed.
I don't remember getting that bad. But certainly the validation station was very useful after punching. Check that things had gone out as intended. Any other questions?
This is anyone who hasn't come is really late. Can I just hand those round and people would kindly...
Can I ask a question while
Yeah.
handing those round? Is that still tables on the drum? How were the tables written to the drum in the first place? Presumably they were read from cards,
Yeah,
and so you would have a special plug board to
so
read the tables in.
you just have a designation on the card to say this was a card that was holding table, do this with it. So you'd have a certain program step that dealt with that.
Did the drum work in binary or was it also decimal?
It was binary coded decimal, wasn't
Yeah.
it?
I mean, it was decimal as far as using it was concerned.
Decimal digits go to 5 bits.
There were 5 tracks, but each track had 4
We had 5 to 1 to hold text if we wanted to, or send box or
One set 21 with input output buttons. Input data was in punch up. And there were 84 10 nibs. And 84 nibs.
Okay, can we move on? Amazingly, Martin, well done. We're still exactly on time. This is a shift sideways now because the next topic that comes up is the M.
Thank Martin.
She figured in a lot of ICT brochures at about that time. I'm sorry, I never knew her name. But it indicates very well, I think, the comparative compactness of the M, because in functionality the M was not very different from what the 542 could do, but it was all in this single cabinet device. Now, as you know, I'm not an engineer, so I'm not confident to talk about its innards, but I thought it's worthwhile showing you also from the brochure this, which is an indication of the structure of the electronic components here. There were a number of turrets fitted in the base. They were in fact 2 wide. The valves on the inside to get the full benefit of the airflow through. Bruce McMillan tells me the main turrets had 16 smaller turrets mounted on them. And this was the main service problem on the end. Removing the smaller turrets required, I think, up to 32 pins, often with several wires on them, to be unsoldered, labelled of course, and then the 4 lugs in the corners of the turrets were folded back, the turret removed and the faulty part replaced. Then it all had to go back together again. Mechanically the end was very reliable. Yeah. Bruce McMillan is extremely sorry he can't be here this afternoon, but he's done his best to participate in it as actively as he can. The latest email I had from him just yesterday afternoon, but I haven't managed to fully decipher, he's effectively done an EMP simulator on an Excel spreadsheet. But I haven't had time to turn that into slides to show how it did actually multiply. As you'd expect, EMP standing for electronic multiplying punch. Multiplication was its principal raison d'etre. Pounds or decimals, cross-adding with up to 3 fields, a maximum of 10 digits. It could summarize, it could take a constant multiplier or multiplicand in from a rate card and then use it in subsequent multiplications. It could do a limited amount of gang punching, picking up a value from a designated card and then replicating that value in subsequent cards down the track. The capacities varied on what you were trying to do. This incidentally shows that it had a variety of decimal, of fractional capabilities. It could use a large number of different denominators. But I think one of the things that's striking, looking back at it nowadays from 40 years later, how small all the numeric fields were. The PCC brochure, we're coming on to the PCC next, has a fully worked example of a payroll program, and nobody got paid more than £10 a week, and nobody earned over £1,000 a year, which meant, of course, that you could get an awful lot into one single 80-column card. It's a very good indication of how things have changed. Anyway, that's basically the capabilities of the thing. Taking the covers off, all the electronics were down in the base, and the top was concerned with reading, punching, and the interface between Power Samus mechanical reading and electrical signals passing down the base for the calculations. Here's a more detailed side view of the top of the machine. We've got the card track running across in this direction from the hopper feeding through a preset station, main set station, punch station, and out to the stacker. This is a convox, a reading convox, to take the input factors from the reading pins here, pass them up to that unit. The electrical connections to that unit are not shown on this, but the sensing read from the card was converted into electrical signals there and passed down into the base. The results came up to this unit here, which translated the results into appropriate pin settings. Those were passed down through another punch convox into the punch pins and out into the card there. So, by contrast with the plugboard technology of the machines we've just been looking at from the Hollerith tradition, the AMP from the Power Samus tradition relied on wire convoxes built in the factory to transfer values from the card columns into the appropriate, what they were called upper columns of the input translation unit at the top. So there were 7 digits for the multiplier, of which 2 were fractional elements. There were 8 to 15 for the multiplier, multiplicand. Again, 3 of those for decimal places of pence. This is rivaling the degree of sophistication and fine calculation which Leo did so well. And there's no cross-adding involved in this calculation. It's just an up to 7-digit multiplier with 2 decimal places times the multiplicand of that form to give a product of that form. The corresponding output the punch convox going with that calculation is of that form. It takes the product which is available in upper columns 6 to 15, and it actually punches out twice into 2 sets of columns. One set stopping with the pence field, and this second set over here including a farthings field. And without, I don't think it's time to go into the subtleties of what was being done with these components. So, by contrast with the BTM calculators, where the machine came in a very empty form, and you programmed it with the details of your application through your plug board on site, in the Powers tradition, the application was worked out in advance by the Powers technical advisor. And the details of the required convoxes went down to the factory in Croydon, where the wires were bent and fitted and so on. And the thing came back, and to run an application, you only had to install the appropriate connection boxes. And seemed to work pretty well in the general run of things, as applications on the whole were not subject to very frequent change. There's a different input convox. This one with 3 cross-add fields in there. Of the 10 digits available for cross-adding, 10 digits maximum, you could have several fields simultaneously there using successive stages of the calculation. And here we've got a field with 2 figures of pounds. Hang on. 3 figures of pounds, shillings and pence. No, I was right. That's a shillings column, because the A position represents 10 shillings, and 1 to 9 down there, or 10 plus 1 to 9 for opposition. 10 pence and 11 pence in the pence column. That's that field is pounds only, I think, or pounds and shillings. And this one is pound shillings. Oh. I'm not sure. That's too small to read properly. Anyway, you get the general impression, I trust. Now I get totally out of my depth, so if anybody wants to step in and do the commentary to these slides, they're very welcome. This is the nearest I've got to a logical explanation of the electronic structure of the machine. And the table up at the top shows the successive stages of a multiplication with a set-in stage for the initial part of the operation, then 2 multiplication stages for the multiplying by the fractional part of the multiplier, set in the remainder of the multiplicand, and then further multiplying stages. Putting that vertically, we get this lovely thing, where unfortunately probably the really intelligible bits I tend to get lost in this snow. But inevitably that was a fairly brief description of a fairly, by comparison with the BTM calculators, the EMP was a fairly simple-minded machine, but it was solid, reliable, and installed in very large numbers and gave very good service for a large number of years. And I do very much hope that the machine in Dunedin, which is complete, will be restored and brought back into working use. And if it is, then CCS may perhaps diversify slightly to work out with Air New Zealand what would be the cost of chartering a flight for the members to go out and
Can I have 2 tickets, please?
Power savers machines in general were able to sell at a lower cost into a greater market because there were more people. Was the EMP cheaper, less cost than the equivalent BTM?
yes, I think so. I haven't got the actual prices, but I think it started at under 6,000. And it was available in 40 column, 65 column and 80 column variants.
One surprised at that. I would have thought that the mechanical operation would be more expensive to manufacture than the electrical operation.
It was existing technology.
Yeah, that's exactly the point. It had all been done before, and it was just
Standard sense boxes and
sense box is absolutely standard, straight out of every reproducer or calculator or interpolator or whatever.
Could I ask Hamish, how many goes did an EMP take to do a gross to net payroll, which could just about squeeze into one program on the 542?
I suppose
120 cards.
120 cards a minute.
120 cards a minute. Yes, that's one.
Yeah, but it didn't have the power to do a gross to net in one run.
Yeah, you could do 8 times plus or minus bonus and tax in the field. Under 20 a minute you could do a calculation.
You probably have to do at least one run to pre-calculate the rate times hours to get the yes, and then a subsequent run with the gross cross subtracting the various deductions to come down to them.
And the tax was pre-calculated from the tables and punched into the card. Yes, that's been it.
The way 542 used to do it, they used to work out the tax, say in July, how much he should have paid up until July.
Yes.
Then they should subtract what he had already paid,
Yes.
and that was the pay for that week.
Yes. Yes. And the reciprocal of 9/7.
Having arrived on the scene far too late to know anything about any of these. How flexible were they? Now having seen you've got plug-board approach, you've got combox approach. Did many companies actually change the plug-boards, or were they sort of one machine, one function, or were they multi-function?
It depends, I think, on the class of business that the user was in. For ordinary commercial accounting, stock management activities, the applications tended to be rock solid. Get the details down first, and then it would run for years and years. How? Thank you. I'd forgotten that dodge. Yes, very good one.
Of course, Hamish, it depends what you mean by change. You may not have changed an individual plug board, the micro individual plug board, but you change plug boards frequently.
Oh yes.
There's an important distinction between the two.
Yes.
Also, when there were tax changes, you used to what the operators, the people who used to be in charge of moving the plugs that they used to put in the new rate of tax.
Yes.
And they could change the tax every day of the week if they wanted to. But I don't think you could do that with Convoxes.
There's another use of Convox's story which I'll throw in. It's not directly on the main line, but it's fun. Does anybody remember Beryl Actie? Who used to live in the demonstration. A very glamorous blonde. Had to keep on the right side of her. She used to demonstrate a job going through the tabulator and producing summary cards, and then taking the summary cards out of the summary card punch, putting them through the tabulator, and producing a list of them. And somebody observed that it was very strange that Convox in the tabulator was doing this sort of pattern of work for the calculation, the main run, the invoices, or whatever they were, and it produced an entirely different. How could those summary cards go through the same Convox to produce that listing? And the answer came out that before she joined Power Sams, Beryl had been the assistant to a stage magician. and you saw one set of cards coming out of the summary card punch. You didn't necessarily see that it was those very same cards that went back into the tabulator.
Can I ask a question of clarification? Even when people are using plug boards, not Convoxes, those whole plug boards have been taken out on mass with all the plugs
yes.
again,
Yes.
another plug board for another
Yes.
plug board.
Yes.
Speaking as a one-time very junior technical advisor, post the merger, so I don't have no affiliations one way or the other. I always felt a lot safer when I was in a BTM installation, because there was a certain amount of trial and error. You could plug things, and if it didn't work, you could eventually get it right. I used to live in absolute terror of the day I would have to design a Convox, because the consequences of getting it wrong was, admission, you know where you could hide it. And you would have to go back to the factory and be rewired at somebody's expense. I only ever did one Convox, and fortunately it worked, but I fear and trembling of it not.
Put it in perspective, the cost of a Convox that's charged to the customer is £30. So I should think the fair one, if you pay 15 and the company pays 50, would be just about right.
Was it 1 week's salary?
Oh, at least.
In the merger stages, you were using square hole cards, sensing. There was a trick there with the round hole and sensor. I know that they had to time them for the Hollerith machines to, in the part of the round hole, in effect, produce a square hole out of it, to read. It wasn't a clean edge. It was a round hole. The brushes had difficulty reading. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, with verification, it was even.
Yes.
And then the brushes had to read the change from the curve. It was a bit tricky out there.
Right, now if we're going to keep on track, at this stage I'd like to ask Gerald Everett and John Harper to take over and start talking about the PCC. But because this is a long afternoon, those seats are not the most comfortable in the world. Would you care to stand up, turn round, stump up and down, but then sit down again? Please don't leave your seats or wander about.
Get deep vein thrombosis. Oh, it's not as well organised.
Okay then, can we sit down again, please? Right. The next subject for this afternoon is the PCC, the Power Summers PCC, the machine which probably of all of them had the most contentious name, because Powers called it the punch card computer, and BTM people invariably turned that final C into calculator. We've got two speakers this afternoon. Gerald Everett is going to go first, followed by John Harper. Great shame that Peter Ellis is not able to be with us, having died beginning of the year, but Gerald will be able to refer to his position working for Peter in the very early days of this machine.
Thank you. It was very intriguing coming in after you started, because I am the second one who wasn't told that we started at 2 o'clock, not 3 o'clock. Can I just have a quick show of hands? How many of you are ex-BTM or Hollerith? Yeah, I thought I was in enemy territory. When I joined Power Summers, which was in 1954, I went to work for Peter Ellis. And it was intriguing. At the time, I didn't know what a punch card was. In the interview, when he asked me what's a punch card, I said it's one of those things you put a needle in the end and you put it out. But the one thing, the impression, so what I agreed with John is I would give you the sort of impressions of what it was like at the time, working on the PCC, then he would carry on afterwards with the details of the machine when it came into production. When I joined in '54, the one thing which was fairly noticeable to a new recruit coming in was the sales force and the sales and the marketing force across the country, with sales offices, area offices, the specialist support from the thing. It seemed like a market that was carved up. And over the hill, we knew there was the enemy. And the enemy was you. That was Hollerith, and in a small way, perhaps IBM. And to a lesser extent, lesser players in the fields were the boroughs and the unit record machines. But the main thing was, this was a very confident sales effect that knew what it was doing, that had the market carved up, and the number of features of its machine was such that it intended to keep it carved up. And the first one of these was, of course, that it had the punch-in with round holes, which were very conveniently too small to put a brush in. They were very positive. The words which were always coming around to us from the salespeople that we met were positive mechanical sensing of a stationary punch card. Even if the card's going at 10 cards a second, it still stopped. Down went the pin through it. No chance whatsoever of a Florida. Poor little pregnant Chad would have given birth in no time at all. The further thing was what punches, adds, all the adding was done with effectively ratchets which came up, and as they came along and printed, then that added up at the same time. So the whole emphasis was upon this, how good mechanical equipment was. There was a cloud on the horizon, and it was a cloud which I think a lot of the people in Power Summers tried to ignore. It was things called magnetic tapes and photoelectric cells. And I can still remember, I think, the old chappie who'd been there for the 50 years that Powers had been around, and who told us confidentially, of course, lad, it will never work, all these new things. There's nothing quite like a good solid pin going through a hole in a card. Anything else is doomed for failure. Well, they lasted the residual part. I suppose we still can get a punch card if we like 50 years later, and that's what he was looking at. The other part I saw of it was the actual marketing of the machines and the sales development. And this, I think, when you were saying about the picture of the EMP up there, I think the great success of the EMP and why did it sell was because, I think, of Peter Ellis. He at the time shortly before, had been an insurance consultant in the head office, and his job was to help all the sales offices outside of the London area with anything attached to an insurance problem. But being a bright young lad, they recognised that there was this great gap that you couldn't multiply. The only thing you could multiply was the McClure punch, half a second per column, bang, bang, put it down in the basement and forget about it, and then one of the days you've got some results coming. And his approach, which is the one which I saw later on, was go out and see the sales force, the district managers in the field, and say, we've got a machine that's going to come along, it's going to do 1 multiplication plus 3 cross adds. Can you sell it? How big can the fields be if you sell it? If it was this size, would you sell it? If it was this size, would you sell it? And eventually you come up with something which has all the best combinations of that will meet a market. It wouldn't meet everything in the market, but it optimised the market. And this approach was done with the PCC, and I saw it later on when I worked with some people from Ferranti on a tape processing machine which was never built. But then on the other hand, I worked on the PCC for 3 years and it was never built, as far as I was concerned. I never made a mistake in testing because I never tested anything. And so it fitted the market. It fitted the market following the MP, with the 2 cross things. And one of the purposes, so Peter Ellis used to say, was he went out there to see, did the next MC or the MD, was it going to be 2 cross multipliers, etc.? Where was he going to go next? And he came to the conclusion the next stage of the market required some form of flexibility in it. And it was in that market that the Power Samus, the PCC, program controlled computer, if you've got a thing which isn't a computer but it's only a calculator, you might as well call it a program controlled computer. If you're going to tell a lie, tell a big lie. Perhaps we'd have the next one. Good, a diagram. The point that was mentioned earlier about the card track and the emphasis upon reading and checking. A stack of cards, a single card going through, it's read, put on the drum. It's checked against the drum, it goes on, it's punched from one of the tracks on the drum, and then it's read back again. Great emphasis upon checking. The magnetic drum had those, in fact there's 6 tracks, there's 2 for the input and there's 4 for the output, because it's all complicated, but somehow or other, I never did understand it, but as the card moves along, you've got to hold up the stuff long enough for the card to get there before you can punch it in. And so there was 2 in, 4 out, and there was also 4 tracks, which were for us to actually do our things on. 4 tracks, 40 words, each word of 20 digits, binary coded digits. The 20 digits, well obviously you've got to have a spare at the front, you've got to have a sign, you've got to have a plus or minus, so it leaves 16 digits that you can do things with, because you also need 1 digit to tell you whether it's sterling or decimal. And the format of the word was the decimal point was 6 places after the decimal and 10 before it if it's in the decimal form, or 6 decimal places, 1 digit for the pence, 2 for the shillings, and the rest for the pounds. And you can just change from one to the other by having a simple instruction that changes a bit. The reading from the card, to get it into the input track of the disk, they are on the first description that I had from the people at Vickers, they said there would be some form of plug board. And this caused a bit of furore because plug boards are what the other lot did. And so they said, let's have connection boxes. And connection boxes just wouldn't work. A connection box is all right for relatively straight, but you can't take a column from over here and push it over this side because wires aren't resilient enough to do that. And so they came up with, which John would show you, I hope, a picture of, because I never saw one, printed circuits, 2 things, put a rivet through them, and as long as you got it right, it was okay. If you got it wrong, you can drill the rivet out and have another go. The programme was also not held on the drum. The drum wasn't intended for such trivial things as that. The drum was intended for good solid data. The programme on the machine that I had was held on punch cards. There aren't many left. It looks nothing at all like the normal punch card that we know. You'll have some difficulty seeing there. But every column punched in normal and interstage, so you've got 24 holes, all of which could be there or need not be there, so you've got 48 possible holes and not holes for every instruction. Those cards, the 4 of them, were put into 4 little slots. The handle turned, down came a lock pin box. No question of a pregnant Chad, it just went through. You've got a good solid fixing of a programme. 160 instructions, 120 in the main programme, 40 in the subroutines, plus 120, plus another 80 built in, and you've got your programme. The modification, well, of course, the only difference between a computer and a calculator is that a computer can do arithmetic on its own instructions, and the calculator can't. I suppose that's a simple definition that Brian Oakley would tell us in the days of computers. If you can't do arithmetic on the programme, because if it's there stuck in a punch card with a pin stuck through the middle of it, it's quite clearly you can't do arithmetic on it. You can always do arithmetic on the counters which address all the stores. And so you can have the same effect, except, of course, you can't do compiling and you can't do what later years we used to call pathological programming, where you used to do arithmetic on the functions and try to do funny things. And then you built into the operating system the means of stopping you doing that. So we could, on this machine, could do all the things that any reasonable, sensible person wanted to do. So, was it a computer? Does it really matter? The basis of it was that it was intended to do payroll, to do gross to net. And certainly the commands that we had, you had all the ones of transfer, input sterling, input decimal, add, subtract, negative transfer. You had the shift by 10, divide by 10, and do a binary shift. Quite amazing when you look back nowadays. This was binary coded decimal, so it seems first of all to multiply by 10 is trivial, because you've only got to delay it or advance it by 1, and you've done the multiply by 10. But when you come to multiplying by 10, when you come to the pounds, shillings and pence, this becomes horrendous, and yet this was built into the machine. And it was built into the machine because basically you were trying to make the program easy. The device, one of the devices used to use, of course, is that there was no multiplication and division. You had to do these on a subroutine. And you will, of course, quickly realise that a quick division by 3 is put a fraction of a decimal, pence in, shift it up the top, change it to sterling, and shift it back again, and do funny things like that. Before you know, you've divided by 960. And 960's got a factor of 3 in it somewhere. And that used to be done all the time, because remember, we had a year or so with nothing better to do than to try things like this. We only had the 160 instructions. It's quite amazing sometimes how, in fact, they work. If you look at it from the other view, in terms of a multiplying punch, of course, it's superb. 160 flexible instructions. Again, the thingers that was sold said the internal workings, all calculations would be done twice. What a waste of time. And just looking at the payroll calculation, I got one of the early ones that we did. We could do a payroll calculation in 38 instructions by having all the constants. And remember, payroll instructions at that time, £100 at 2 and 6pence, 150 at 5 bob, 150 at 2 and 6, and then the big boys came in and had the rest of it at 9 shillings in the pound. So it's only a question of going around a loop, subtracting, as it was indicated here, the necessary constants and also the 7/9, the 2/9 of earned income relief that you got beforehand, change all the constants, take 7/9 of the rate and 9/7 of the stages, and you've got it all there. The interesting thing looking at that, which I did the other day, of the 38 instructions, the actual bit, the loop that calculated the tax, was 9 instructions. It took 12 instructions to set the conditions for, is it week 1, weekend, emergency code, are you using the Siemens table, which is different, sounds pretty disgusting, but, and then you needed another 13 instructions to round the taxable pay, because at that time, tax had to fit in with what the Inland Revenue said. And the Inland Revenue said, look down the tax table, and it goes up in 5 shilling steps to a certain, then it goes up into 10 bob steps, and then it goes up in pounds. And doing the simple thing, which is ignoring all that and working it out accurately, didn't fit in with the budget proposals and the implementation of the budget proposals. So we spent 13, we spent more instructions rounding it off beforehand so that we could do the calculation. The multiplication routine, which I think, oh no, sorry, go back to that one if you like. Have you got go back feature? Yeah. You did on the early PCs. Peter Ellis there, this was in the early days, with in the showroom where, did somebody call her Bell? Letty? Bell? We always called her Mrs. because we were very young and Mrs. Peter Ellis was there, and of course one of the difficulties always with this is that whenever you've got something on the board behind you, try to make it look impressive. So he churned around things there with divisions and all the rest of it. The fellow on the right, I think I must go down to not dye my hair white any longer. It's much better that way. Sorry, on to the next one. The multiplication subroutine, again, instructions 0 to 7, you haven't even started. All you're doing there is you've got put in a 0 in the 0 instruction, you're clearing the thing. You take 3 instructions to make both of them of the correct sign, and then you've got 3 instructions to get them all normalised, so that you're not multiplying fractions by fractions. Then you do a bit of things, and then you do a few more at the end. So the general feeling all the time is rather like an architect on a building. You fit everything in nicely, and then you have to go along and put big atriums at the beginning of them. The same way with this. You got the thing down to a good loop, and then you have to put all this rubbish at the front. Finally, just a few points. One of the points about com boxes that came up, and as was said earlier, you had a com box for an application. The com box was designed by your friendly local technical rep, and he charged you £30 for making it. So why shouldn't they charge you £30 for doing your friendly little local rep, getting someone to do you a little friendly program? And when the programs came along on 4 flexible punch cards, you didn't even have the excuse of charging them £30. So programs were things which were given away with the applications. And I don't know how long it took before ICT decided that they had to start doing something, but they didn't. They certainly didn't then. They were all for nothing. Did the machine work? What did you say? I don't know. John will tell us. It didn't. It was a theoretical machine when I joined in '94. The first time I ever got a program to run in Anglo on a machine was at the end of '97, and I'd left Powers by then. It was on a fifth machine. I believe Peter Wilmer, who worked there at the time, I think he did actually get something working on the prototype machine, which was British Railways at Swindon. But it wasn't that sort of era. In fact, the machine was first announced at the BEE in 1955. On the day it was announced, it shows how the sales force had got the customer base tied up. the district manager for Coventry found out what it was and sent in an order for 10 of them at £10,000 each, because he knew that all of his customers would want one. He will then talk to them afterwards about what they were actually going to do with it, but he thought it was a good thing. And so it was on display, the prototype, at the BEE in 1955. On the Tuesday before, we went to Crayford. We had a company car to take us to Crayford because there was a rail strike on. And when we saw the people at Crayford, they said, things are going all right. The card track's working, dead boggle. We can't find anything wrong with the electronics. The program sensing device is all okay. We've got the drum in at the moment being baked. Hopefully it's due out of the oven at lunchtime. We'll then connect it up and screw down the heads. And if it's all well, oh yes, it's not worth your while going home. You might as well stay. You might be able to have the machine at the end of the afternoon. And then later that evening they got it out and screwed the heads down. And then they came back and said, we're going to have to rebake the surface on the drum because we've screwed too many heads down too close and we've scratched too many of them. And meanwhile, there was the exhortation from Big Boss who said the future of the company depends upon this being properly exhibited. And at that time, we had no compunction about working out very quickly a payroll calculation which took the gross pay from one card and put it as the net pay on the card in front of it. We got it wrong because the complexities of the punch track were such that it was actually came out at 2 cards in front of it, which made it even more difficult for anybody else to see it. And I would never tell a lie in my life, but when probably one of you came up to me at the BEE and said, come on, tell us the truth, you've got all the answers stored on the drum, haven't you? I was able, without batting an eye, I promise you, there are no answers on the drum. Thank you.
So you shouldn't start with an apology, but I will apologise for this beating. We could have tried experimenting with it, but I think we might have ended up with it not working at all if we'd have tried that. It's all to do with something. It's all right on there. It's the interaction with frame and line breaks, I think. I'm afraid we'll have to put up with that. I shouldn't really be doing this at all because I got into this act when all the machines were bedded down and they're all working extremely well. All they needed was an engineer to pretend to come along and prod it occasionally from time to time. There are people here who I expect, maybe even hope, will heckle. We've seen that. That was the beginnings. A larger picture. It's slightly strange that the last Hamish was actually called it 656 for a 65 column and a 856 for 80 column. Now I don't know why the Hollerith equivalent wasn't renumbered to fit in with this, but for some reason it was decided to renumber the Hamish equipment to fit in with the BTM. So we have this rather strange 556 and 557 coming in, presumably because superior to the treble fives, and then even later the 558 coming in, which we'll talk about another day, which I suppose is even more superior. Little local rivalry. Yeah, if you like. You've got as long as.
Well, you said one thing and it says another one too.
Oh.
865, 853.
Whatever's on there was right. It's just me. As we know, it was first exhibited at the British Efficiency Exhibition, 55. It's said that 70 orders were taken at that point. Then 2 prototypes were available in the autumn of 66, but regular deliveries didn't really get going until mid-57. So it wasn't exactly a very fast take-up. we've estimated that 200 were delivered. A lot of this information, by the way, I'm thankful to Roy Newbury here for digging out. Last shipment was in the first quarter of 1961. Now this is a list of the first 60 or so customers out of approximately 200. Look, it's not worth going through them all, but it's an interesting list in its own right as being a sign of the age. There was still the vestige of a Commonwealth there. There was even French being prepared to buy equipment from British manufacturers. If anybody wants to pick out any there particularly, it is a very interesting list.
John, can I mention that when Steele and I first met, the marvellous occasion when 2 PCCs were put into building the British Rail in Crewe with salesman Bill Lumbers, not happy memory. A great occasion that, wasn't it?
I'm interested, I don't see us there. We took our first delivery in the Bank of England at the end of 1958. We had a second one. I think we used them up until about 1963, yes. I don't see our name there.
Secret.
Probably the only ones you only had the ones they paid for.
Well, this was the shipping list that we managed to dig out for the first 60 or so. Were they later, or was it got out of sequence or something? This is only about a third of the machines.
Ah, yes, I see.
Do you know anything about that Ford Motors machine? Because I was with Ford at the time, and while Ford itself used about house names machines, I don't recall there being a PCC.
The answer's coming from behind.
I think there was one at Upminster in Essex. I've been on it.
Not necessarily
Peace Park. Probably Peace Park.
There certainly wasn't one at Upminster, because about all the time they Ford had a child installation at Upminster. I was in charge of it.
Near the station.
Yeah, I mean, I know the building.
It was a Greek.
Where all the punch holes were. They're all punching on holes.
The list that is shown, ladies and gentlemen, is actually a copy of a forward marketing requirement that would have been sent down to Payroll as the potential destination for these machines. So it's quite plausible that the odd customer can actually change at a later stage. This is a production requirement placed on the early manufacturing customers.
I've had a press on this.
Significance of the heavy Australian content.
Good salesmanship.
You would have thought that putting out new technology, a company would tend to put it out where a single nucleus of engineers could be trained in the equipment. It didn't work like that. Power Samus certainly, and ICT later, thought that it was important to scatter new technology so that the widest possible population of engineers could be swept up in this forward-looking thing. So yeah, you get Australia, South Africa, and every bit of Australia.
Well, the first EDS, the 282 disk controller, the first one I installed was in Sweden.
Yeah, we did even better though, didn't we, in ICL in the end? We invented a thing called New Range, spread it all around the world, and it didn't even work. We talked about prices earlier. Best information we've got is that through the time that it was sold, it was £13,000 to £9,500. Just to give you an idea, that's about £300,000 today's prices. So this equipment was not cheap. It gave the impression, perhaps, by the figures that we've been talking about, but well, there's a lot in the box, admittedly. Some statistics, physical, weigh about 1,600 weight. I've shown some sizes there. And those sizes do not include the fact that there was a funnel type thing on top to get rid of rather a lot of hot air out of the chimneys.
I was on the stand at BE looking after 1202, and the PCC was next door, and in Olympia they had these gauze sort of bring the ceiling down, and above the PCC there was this big black mark. Some bloke came along and said, I thought you've using smokeless fuel on them.
Yeah, there are also some, this photograph doesn't show you the power supply. It's a fairly large box. And most of them were delivered with a thing called a clawed lines regulator, which was a way of keeping the main stable. A lot of them were delivered into sites where there was manufacturing facilities on the same site. And power varied quite a lot. And this clawed lines thing was a motorised 3 variacs on the same shaft, effectively. And it sensed the upward voltage and just wound the thing round with a small motor. They were 3-phase, normally 415 volts 3-phase, but there were lots and lots of weird voltages that were picked up from some of the French ones, 220. They were virtually part of the order to say what the mains was before it was delivered. Power consumption was around 7.5 kilowatts, so that's where most of that heat went up those chimneys. Valve heaters were in the main cabinet, but the HT, which was mainly 200 volts, was in this other square box that stood alongside, which I never actually opened one up, so it didn't go wrong. I've said about the clawed lines. Normally they were installed that way. In fact, I never saw any installed any other way, but in this long line. But in theory, those 2 units could be installed separately, L-shaped, T-shaped, and normally that end would fit on this end and make a long system. We've talked about the card track. Here's give you some idea of the cards going there, first sensing station, second punching, third sensing station, and the receiver. That was quite an interesting device because it had, rather than offsetting the card, much as BTM did for most of their error cards, it actually inverted it. Obviously it was important that you had the end, one corner of the card chopped off, that you knew it had been inverted. But I was told that this could be used to great advantage if you turn the switch, which said that they all got inverted except for the error cards. So you could do a second pass on the cards, starting with the answer from the previous run.
That's essential for a group bonus, where you've got a gang bonus. You work out the bonus for each of the individual people and add it all up and punch it in the last card. And then when you want it next time, you want that card first so you can spread it over the members of the gang. And for the same reason, they had, I don't know whether the proper things did, but our theoretical machine had an automatic token attachment. So you could tell when you got to the last card that it was a last card before you got to the next card, which was the first of the next lot.
It certainly had card counters on the main control panel.
Yes, so you had a switch which said punch only these fields when you've got to the end of a batch.
Right. The mechanism was quite, I wanted to get a diagram of this, but I couldn't. But instead of the cards just dropping down, they were actually taken up, swung round and brought down at an angle like that. It's almost like somebody did it in Le Mans, didn't they, with a car recently? Not only did we have 80 columns, we had 65 column round hole cards. It could be, and we had this interstage thing that those that haven't heard about it of effectively doubling up by punching more holes halfway between the rows. And of course then you could verify it, which stretched the hole into a figure of 8. By the time you'd done that on an interstage card, there wasn't much left. I think I've covered those the other things there. One particular advantage, what we spoke about earlier about on the amp was actually being able to read the whole card in one go, quickly, and more to the point, when it came to the PCC, early in the cycle. You didn't have to wait for all the brushes to drop down all the holes, all the way across the card, before you could actually start a sensible calculation. I have to try and describe this. The card comes in and fits between two plates, just to hold it in a great position against stops. This mechanism comes down. If a sense pin doesn't find a hole, it stays at about that position. Now if it does find a hole, it drops down. It allows this thing called a hatchet pin to swing over, get in the way, so when this plate is power driven back up again, where there was a hole, this hole will all be pushed upwards and make electrical connections right across the top. So by the time that car, you've gone down and come back up again, you have got all the information electrically available. Punching was quite an interesting thing. Again, it was, this didn't particularly gain any time. It was quite an interesting thing to see. We have pendulums here. And this is a punch setter, as it's called here. Effectively, it's a whole plate with, say, 80 times 12 latching pins in it. And the punch setter goes round and latches all of these down where it wants a hole to be punched. When the whole lot is set in, this goes ba-junk. Quite some heavy castings at the side to hold all this. And it just punches the card all in one go. In order to get this set in, and to save on magnets, etc., you don't have 960 magnets floating around. You have a lesser set, and this mechanism swings across and sets in a row, moves across, set in another row, carries on until it's set the whole lot. And if you, one of the distinctive noises of a PCC when it's running was this sort of soaring noise as it set in the punch. In fact, that was the main noise other than the fans. Right, I'll move on to technology now. I don't think there's much difference between the technology here than the technology in BTM equipment, actually. I think if you seem to remember, we managed to swap some of the double triodes with each other in the end, and they eventually sorted out the appropriate part numbers that matched them up. Double triodes was the prime use, but we had thermionic diodes, 6AL5s, as well on B7G bases. We were using selenium diodes from STC, that range of Q85, etc. And other diodes which are in large numbers, CG10Es. Now I think they were germanium, but because I wasn't certain, I didn't think I'd write it down. Printed circuits were beginning to come in, actually. Very crude, very simple. I'll come back to that in a moment, the printed circuit boards, by the way. Here's a typical circuit drawn by Roy about 50 years ago. Just gives you some idea of the way in which the flip-flop action went. Those that know about these things will understand all that. So that was the basic storage element. The basic gating element, I need to explain slightly here. There's 4 of them on here. And in effect, you've got here, you've got your gating with the CG10E diodes. So, I won't go into the explanation, but you've got the AND function here of these diodes. 2 were built onto a particular car, turret as they called it. But you could fan out more. You could either put it into a little extension device, or you could distribute them around the machine. So a particular AND gate function did not have to be at that point. It could be around as long as you put a diode in to come to the same position. I think I saw as many as 8 in some circuits. I'm quite happy with a large input gate. Oh, and I've said that the signal levels were nominally 125 volt and 75 volt. Quite a nice swing now when you think about 1 or less on modern equipment. Should punch its way through something or other. That is an extremely poor sketch of my own, attempting to show a turret, a plug-in turret. 1 or 2 other people who have got better memories than I will actually say that's got slightly wrong, but I think it's along the right lines anyway.
So they learned the lessons on the end rather rapidly, that you had to get these things out to repair them. You didn't have to unfold everything. So you could actually, well, it's advisable to take the power off first, but just pull the handle and it comes away, the whole unit. This goes into the chimney, so this is where the black smoke that Aidan was talking about was generated. Components were, there was a bit of leakage of air up this way with the force, so components were cooled a little, but not indirectly rather than directly. And then there's these connections I showed at the handle end. This needs a little explaining. This is the handle end again, with the connections here. And you have to imagine this printed circuit board is being rotated through 90 degrees, to give you an idea. So those connections plug onto the end of these printed circuit tracks. And there's 8 of these across, typically on of those turrets. And the connections are taken out to the edge of this printed circuit board. And this is where the bulk of the interwiring went on, down the sides of the machine. So that's where all the logic signals and the power systems were created down the side of the machine. That's a typical counter and decoder circuit, and also showing the type of the simplification of a flip-flop and a gate circuit with a cathode follower. So that's the way in which the whole machine was described on its logic diagrams. Well, I didn't call them those in those days. Now we move on to the drum. 6.5 inches down, 6.5 inches tall, equivalent to 2,850 RPM, 3-phase motor, stood vertically on one side of the machine. It had its own motor. Apparently on prototypes it didn't have its own motor. It's a very good flywheel, so when it got a card wreck, it tore everything apart. And it had a clutch as well, so oh dear. No need to work through that timing, except to say that the machine did approximately 1,000 instructions per second. Now, I don't know how that compared with ones we've spoken about, or perhaps Dickie will make a
I'm just trying to do the arithmetic. I'll let you know in a minute.
Yeah, give you time to it.
I could do the arithmetic and it comes out to 1,000 instructions per second, but I'm pretty certain that we had 850 APs per card was available to us.
Well, so we're talking about 2,000.
Yeah, I think so, but I don't. I'll consult afterwards.
Across this drum, there were 50 tracks, and the other thing that's worth saying at this point, there was a parity on each word. There were 6 fast stores, which I will touch on in a minute, and 160 slow stores. I'm not expecting to go through that in detail. To give you an idea, we talked earlier about the 2 input stores. These are the main stores in which the data was stored during the processing. 4 output stores and the fast stores. That just shows you a diagram of the input stores and the output stores. This is, for example, is where the comparators were. Third sense, compare the card with what's on the drum with what is supposedly being punched. If it compares, carry on. If not, rotate, invert the card. This is the format of the word, which we've touched on before. Decimal format is quite interesting with the pounds, pence, shillings. And in this case, we do go up to, I think, £1 million. No, we go more. Never mind. Got rid of programming with plug boards, etc. by putting rivets between the program line, saying we're on step so-and-so of a program instruction, through diodes to produce the driving lines to control the whole of the machine's logic.
So a program that was running without jumps would step through these, bringing these alive. Rivets coming through would bring the current, the voltage to the higher side, and then this will be picked up on the appropriate diode blocks to produce the lines into the machine to control the functions. The program cards, I haven't got a particularly good diagram, picture, but what I've shown here is that the same technique was used for what they call overhead cards, which is effectively getting rid of the COM box by doing a straight connection. These were printed circuit cards with X and Y, and you could rivet through them. And the DTNT boards, but I won't go into that because it's taking too much time. Won't go into instructions in detail, but I'll just give you a flavour for them. The point was it was double operand, fast and slow, quite a lot of additional functions. That's just a typical example. Those were the conditionals, which are fairly powerful. General instructions, quite a lot of them. And then we go to the subroutines. Now these were built in to the machine, and Gerald's already touched on the multiplication. Farthings to decimal was quite an important function. That's just showing again what Gerald showed you before. That's a repeat. Now we'll go on to the architecture. This is where I get to the point where I could start on a great discussion about what is a computer, what isn't a computer. Now this is not far removed from a computer's architecture. 3-highway system, arithmetic unit stores, data input, data output, program controlled. That is the arithmetic unit in more detail. We touched earlier on how complex it was to do arithmetic functions on Sterling. Here's the adder, that's pretty simple. We had all this junk, if you like, around the outside to deal with Sterling. Fast stores, by the way, were done by, I think someone mentioned this earlier, by leaving data on the surface of the drum just between the write and the read head, then erasing it. And then the same part of the surface would be used to store different data on a later area. So that's the general function. Here we have, for example, the data is being written here, read there, is circulating around through the amplifier and going back on, and isn't getting past this permanent magnet. It's being used again. So it's a sort of delay line store equivalent, but on the surface of a drum. Shifting was quite interesting. Here's 20-digit times, the circulating gate, showing the circuit going round here. But if you wanted to multiply, which way around? Either multiply or divide. I've got muddled, doesn't matter, you'll work it out. You would actually shift it, you could shift it by taking it around 19, and these were just mechanically set to 19 digit times apart. Normal use, this fast store would have one delay element to make it up to 20 bits. So normally that would be flowing. If you did want it to bring it out earlier, you bring it out through this gate. There was also one other faster store with two of these, so you could shift two at a time. Quite a good control panel, which I'm not going to go through. That was on the back end of the machine. There's also a bit of an engineer's panel in the middle, although the engineers spent most of their time on this one, and an operator's panel on the front. Finally, reliability and maintenance. Machines that I was last involved on managed to get to a 98.5% uptime on one machine, and 99.9% across two machines. This was a BMC service, which shifted all the spares for all BMC cars throughout the world. Now this figure could even be taken up to 100 because we never missed in the time I was involved shifting the spares to the distributors on the day. So even though you have one of your machines out and the other one fails for a short period of time, there's enough slack in the day to bring this right back up. And the other thing that we spoke about was errors and parity. This machine was passed in parity, which I haven't got into. With all the checking, the number of, you did get inversions of cards, but they were quite few, and they were nearly down to input cards being faulty, nothing to do with the calculation. And the number of times that you got an error allegedly coming back from the customer saying you had got something wrong was about one a month. And then they were usually proven wrong. So they weren't at all bad.
Thank you.
Right. Can I suggest we move quickly on, because we're very fortunate this afternoon to have Dr. Raymond Dickey Bird with us, the originator of the BTM 1201-1202 family. And for those of us, the few people here who are not card aficionados, it's worth pointing out that in their time, the 1201 and 1202 computers outnumbered all other computers installed in the UK. So all the other computer families which come more from the scientific or mathematical traditions, punch card computers actually did more computing than all the lot of them.
What date? What date? What sort of time?
This was the mid to late 50s.
Can you help me with that? Okay.
The engineer was
Dicky, do you want
Can
that
we squeeze this round here? We might need, I don't know if people can see it, but we put it up a bit.
something happened through the road. I'm not sure I was ever told about it. I misunderstood. He discovered if you stop the machine, took the ball out, put a strip of sellotape over it from the round rivets, and put it back in, and do the rest of the job out of your work. That was the way it carried on running for the rest of his days, so far as I know. When you think it takes a correcting stuff.
double-sided sticky tape.
Well, first of all, apologise for people not being informed about the 2 o'clock. I found out about, Hamish told me about 3 weeks ahead, and I was sure he couldn't get into the paper in time. Miss Tinsey got on the web. Who would like to come and have a meal afterwards?
Okay, so we'll get our...
Right. Thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I thought I'd just have a little bit of history as how all this started, because Hollerith was not computer-minded. As was explained earlier, IBM had come in with calculators which had put the wind up Hollerith, because they thought that not only were calculators be needed, but computers as well. I was a signals officer in the RAF, and then messing about with radar and pulses and that sort of thing, and got poached from GEC research laboratories by a chap called Womersley, who had been at the MPL and started off the ACE pilot model. And I joined BTM in January 1951 under Womersley. Billy Woodshill, Lauren Knight and the calculator people were there already in a different building. We were always very friendly, particularly as Billy Woodshill and I were both ex-RAF, so we got on all right. Womersley did a good job in that he looked around the computers that were available in the UK and in America and decided they were all too big and complex and heavy, like mercury delay lines or touchy cathode ray tube stores, that something smaller would be wanted, something cheaper. And he found Dr. Booth, who was a professor or doctor at Birkbeck College doing crystallography, who'd been to the States and got intrigued with computers because crystallography needs a hell of a lot of computing. And he, in fact, was a born engineer. He didn't know it, but he was. He could do things simply and cheaply and efficiently with the smallest amount of equipment, and he also had no money. So he persuaded BTM to give him punch card machines for free if we could go and copy his Apex machine, which consisted of 2 post office racks full of double triode B7G valves, as the PCC was using, and we were sent down to copy this machine, bring it back and build it. So we went down to a place called Fenny Compton in a very cold winter in 1952 to copy this machine, bring back the plans, and then we built one up in the lab and of course connected a tabulator onto it. We also were immediately imbued with the idea that unlike the university's machines, which were built for calculating, computing, masses of computing, the input and output wasn't exactly trivial as far as universities were concerned, but they really wasn't the thing. That if you were going to go into a commercial installation, it was the volume of data you could get in and out that mattered. The computing on the whole was trivial as far as time was concerned. So we had to also realize that Hollerith was there because of Sterling in this country. If they hadn't had Sterling in this country, IBM would not have parted from us. So in a way, Sterling gave BTM a bit of a breather. So we came back and built the HET machine, which again was post office racks, valves sticking up all over the place, wired up solid, no plugs and sockets, magnetic drum, with only 16 tracks at that time, 16 words around it. But we started already by making a convert box, which enabled, as the punch card came down, to make sure the machine, which was binary, I must insist on that, it's binary, not Binary 10, binary machine. How the hell did you get binary into a machine from a punch card? And we made a circuit where you stored on the drum the equivalents of a whole in binary in each of the columns. So you'd have, if it was decimal, you would have the binary equivalent of 10,000, 1,000, 100 and so forth. As the card went down, if it was a 7-hole, it switched on the adder and stopped at 0. If it was a 5-hole, it switched on the adder for that particular column. So by the time the card was ready, you've got the decimal or sterling, didn't matter what, it could be average of par, converted to binary in the card movement downwards. Now, I'll just go through very quickly the logic of what the machine consisted of, because it's the absolute basic almost the minimum you can have if you're going to have a drum control computer. A drum with a clock track on it. Clock is counted, and then to find out where you are on the drum there you have a coincidence circuit that compares the word count where you are with the word count you want. You have a reading and writing series of circuits with relays, in this case, to select the tracks. And then you can read out a word or shoot back the word onto the drum according to where you are on the drum. The instruction consisted of a single address for what you wanted to do, read or write onto the drum, a counter to determine shifts, how long a multiplier lasted, anything you needed to count, a function, of which there were 32. These were very basic and straightforward. There was a multiplier in there, but no divider, nothing very fancy. And then there was the instruction address for the next instruction. So the machine obeyed an instruction, went and got the next instruction, obeyed an instruction, and so on. Unless it got to a jump or a test, whereby it tested the sign of the digit of the accumulator and could either then jump to that as the next instruction or that as the next instruction. So we have this all important jump facility. 2 shifting registers, 32 bits long, interconnected with shifting circuits, so you could join them all in one string, shift each individually, and so forth. The adder, if you wanted to add, was put in the interconnecting link from beginning to end of the accumulator register, so you could add and subtract. This register was also used for staticizing what you wanted to print, and also took in the input when you read. There was a multiplier register so that you could set up there the multiplier, and the multiplican was whistled down off the drum and added into the accumulator if you needed it, if there was a 1 in the multiplier, but not if there was a 0. So the multiplier chucked along like this, the multiplican came down off the drum into the accumulator if there was a 1, not if there was a 0. Don't ask me about negative numbers because that's a little bit of a trick, but that was basically what happened. The other trick was that as the multiplier got shorter, as you tested these digits, the product got longer. So you could use the multiplier register to get a double length product if you wished it. The functions, add, subtract, multiply, and divide, were decoded in a function tree, which was some of these beautiful selenium rectifiers you were mentioning. STC made these selenium rectifiers where you could decide on how many little disks you wanted in each pack and how big those disks were. So it was completely variable as to current and voltage. So very useful. They were slow, but that was the only trouble. So you took a function there, put it on this mesh of diodes, beautifully arranged in a binary pattern, and that produced the stimulation of one line out according to what function you wanted, the add line, the subtract line, the multiply line, and so forth. The control circuit with all the special circuits for keeping this lot going, and as I was saying, the special conversion box that enabled us to read off the drum all the equivalents in binary of a 1 hole in each of the columns we wanted, add them all simultaneously as the card went down, so at the end of the card passage down, you have in the accumulator the binary equivalent of decimal, sterling, or whatever it is you happen to have pulled off the drum. The whole lot came to about 500 vowels, of which 100 were hot diodes. There were no germanium diodes, they were all thermal diodes, except for the selenium rectifiers, which I told you about. So there we were. It worked, and we were very happy with it. There were about 4 or 5 of us in the team at the time, and nobody took much notice of us. Occasionally, a more, what shall I say, imaginative or frightened engineer or salesman came and looked round the door and said, "What the hell are you doing?" The very forward-looking salesman, Cedric Dickens, was already selling it, when it was just a sort of few bits of wire. And he brought down, one of the first people who tried to sell it to was Hill, the bookmakers. What was Hill's Christian name? William Hill. And they came down in great big black limousines and parked outside this place and came in with, they almost looked like the mafia. And they kept an absolutely straight face during all this thing. And we said, well, what do you want it for? And they said, well, accumulators. Well, what's an accumulator? We got an accumulator. Oh, no. Somebody comes and puts an accumulator bet on. And we got fixers or settlers that can do everything in their head, but accumulators sometimes beat them. And if we get an accumulator bet, we can be £100,000 down. So that's what they wanted, something that could do that. So anyway, I sort of brightly said, well, I'm glad something's being used for sporting purposes. They said, brother, this is strictly business. So that was that. So let's come down to the list of machines again and see where we got to. Having produced this scrappy test bed, which couldn't possibly be exhibited, we were given an order that by the Business Efficiency Exhibition of 1953, we've got to have a sanitised version ready. So we cleaned it up, piped some of the signals around through coax, but at that time there were no plugs and sockets inside the machine. All the chassis were still wired up solid. It was covered in a nice box. That's worth saying. We had a chap called Dick Chandler who was a covers expert. He could cover anything, any machine he could cover. He used to come along with a punch card and measure it up as though he was doing a sort of suit. And he'd go away and he'd come back with a set of black covers and on they'd go and they'd fit. You know, all the bumps, all the marvellous man. Anyway, look, Hollerith had all of these sorts of services, which was a great joy if you were developing something. Anyway, so HEC 2 was made, went to the Business Efficiency Exhibition, didn't work because we transported it in a van. We were trying to work all night. The people who ran the Business Efficiency Exhibition were really the electricians. They had a hell of a union, and you couldn't get them to work late unless you bribed them and gave them bottles of scotch and things. So while our publicity manager, Coulson, Arthur Coulson, was bribing them with scotch, we went on working, and Olympia is a huge great hall, a great arch, as black as night, with just the light shining on one stand. But then down the other end there was another light shining. So we walked all down this dark thing, and there was Pausanias, I think trying to get the amp going. Anyway, so we exhibited it. We did trivial things, a silly little payroll. We had noughts and crosses demonstration, which worked absolutely stupidly until all the children came along and pressed all the buttons simultaneously. And bidding a hand of alcohol at bridge, so you could select from a fan of cards, those cards you wanted an alcohol bridge, and through it went and out again. We did, again, bite off more than we could chew. What time have I got to be over by?
You can't stop yet.
We, again, bit off all we could chew. A Hungarian, I think he was, came up to the stand and persuaded the publicity people that he was a calculating genius and that he could mouth a card quicker than our machine could. And we said, rubbish. And so we got this chap, and we had 2 8-digit decimal numbers, and we had to go over the card punch. And so they read out the numbers, she punched the card, and by the time we got it going down the feed, he said, the number is 1726. So, another deflation for the cocky little buggers. So, then it was decided that HEC 2 would never do it for commercial purposes because the input and output were so limited. It was either print or punch, and the number of columns was limited, that we'd have to try and make a batch for scientific purposes. So HEC 2M, which was called the Turbo 1, was produced, and we built 7 of those, and they went to GEC Research Laboratories, Wembley, SO Forley, Boston Down, ARA Bedford, RAE Bedford, both aircraft research establishments, and one went off to India, and a demonstration model, and one went off to India to the Mathematical Laboratory at Calcutta. Thank you very much. And we never heard a word from it, not a word. It just went there, and we found out later it had gone straight out to Russia. So, whether that did anything to the Cold War, I don't know. But that's what happened. And then finally, we produced a commercial machine called HEC4. That was, the prototype was working in January '56. So rather than bore you with all the details of how much went into what, I used to find out what went on before, the last of the list, and then we would see what difference there was between the first Apex HEC1 and the final machine. HEC4s had 4 registers rather than 2. This enabled us to take more columns in and convert them on the input, and similarly on the output. The drum had gone up to 1,024 words, nice binary numbers you'll notice all the way. The word had stretched to 40 bits so we could get 10 decimal Sterling digits in the field, and 32 functions, which wasn't particular. We'd also got a built-in divider, a built-in converter, both for input and output. So you converted the cards in or converted binary to Binny 10 or Binny Sterling, so that could work the print wheels or punch counts. We had a faster multiplier. The original multiplier just had the multiplican recorded once on a drum track. So it took 1 drum revolution for each binary digit in the multiplier. What we did was duplicate that all the way around the track, so it could take 16 multiplicans off in 1 rev of the drum. So much better input, much better output. We also had an output store